Chapter 2. Breach. As he took a step toward the storeroom, a concussion rocked the deck. Jimmy went flying face first into the locked doorway, then fell to his knees. His mask drooped around his neck, and he raised his hand to his face. A large cut had opened up under his left eye. Blood ran down his cheek. The deck was suddenly bathed in flashing amber warning lights.
"Breach alert on Deck G!"
came an announcement from a frenzied comms officer.
"Retreat to designated shelters immediately!"
Across the deck, he could hear the heavy blast doors slamming shut. Fear climbed up his spine like a ladder and sent a grappling hook into his brain. The terror he thought to escape in a whoosh-induced haze was happening on the very deck where he stood. He began to hyperventilate, and his heart pounded. In contrast to the panic-inducing message from the comms officer, a soothing recorded female voice issued new instructions over the speakers.
"Blast doors secure. Rules of in-ship enemy engagement are in effect. Intradeck movement restricted. Hold your position."
Calm and collected, the serene woman repeated her oddly terrifying phrase every 30 seconds. Jimmy stood up shakily and wiped the blood away. His heart felt like it was going to explode out of his chest. Oddly, he felt no pain from his wound. The soul-crushing fear and horror that had been chasing him for months was upon him. He wanted to vomit. He wanted to run away and hide, but he knew there would be nowhere it wouldn't find him. Part of his mind was screaming about the breach. The drums have put a Sasari on board. Then the junkie part of his mind surfaced. Nobody would be watching the door to the medical storeroom. Inside were drugs that would make him forget, or at least not care. Nobody could fault him for going in now, right? He slid up the mask over his bloody cheek with shaking hands, trying to get his breathing under control. He reached for the injector, but was interrupted by shouting. Was that Jeff? He stopped and listened, but instead heard the calm woman's voice again.
"Blast doors secure. Rules of in-ship enemy engagement are in effect. Intradeck movement restricted. Hold your position."
Amber lights were still flashing. "Feck!" That was Jeff shouting. He sounded upset. Jeff wasn't a guy easily flustered, but the ship had been breached. Was the Sasari upon them? But no, if the beast was on deck between blast doors, he'd surely know it. They'd all be dead already. He looked back at the storeroom. From down the corridor, he heard banging. "That's bullshit!" shouted Gia. Damn it, Jimmy thought. Terror buzzed through him like an electrical current. He was barely hanging on to his sanity. He thought he might actually die on the spot. But somehow, he couldn't selfishly break into the storeroom while his squad mates might need help. He'd done precious little for them up to this point, and Isamu had been good to him. But the Sasori... The thought clawed at his mind, threatening to finally untether him from reality. Amber lights and banging. The woman repeated her message. Despite his crippling fear and self-hatred, he couldn't just ignore them. Cursing, he threw down the mask and pocketed the injector. Biting down his hysteria and weak from panic, he headed toward Jeff's voice. He headed toward the voices. Shortly, he came upon Jeff and Gia banging on a blast door that closed off the portside corridor. Where was Isamu? Spots tumbled past his eyes, and he knuckled them away. The calm woman maddeningly repeated her phrase. "Shit!" yelled Jeff. "There has to be something. We're in lockdown. What did you think they were going to say?" asked Gia. "You're already in the shit for calling in. We have to find a defensible position." "We're not leaving him," said Jeff. "What's going on?" Jimmy asked, trying to remain steady. His back was soaked with sweat, and he was shaking from fear and withdrawal. "What the bloody hell are you doing here?" asked Jeff. "You were told to go to the dock." Jeff's face hardened. "There's a feckin' stinger on this deck, man." Jimmy nodded, his hands balled into fists, tearing the skin on his right palm. "Where's Isamu?" "He got caught behind the damn blast door," said Gia. "He was... Shit! Why are we talking to this fecking duel? What the hell are we gonna do?" Won't they send a "TAC team?" asked Jimmy. His teeth had begun to chatter. He jammed his hand into his pocket and fumbled with the injector. "TAC team," laughed Jeff. "That thing is in there right now, killing anything it finds. Then it's going to start tearing through the corridor walls to do God knows what. It's going to be death all around before any TAC team gets here." There was a sound of twisting metal and a muffled scream from behind the blast door. The deck grating rattled. "Shit," said Gia, fear showing on her face. "Jeff, we gotta go. They don't feckin' open blast doors when a Sasori breaches the hull." "Feck!" screamed Jeff. He pulled his blaster and looked at it hopelessly. Not only wouldn't it be any use in opening a blast door, it likely wouldn't be much use against the alien creature. A short chirp sounded from Jeff's wrist. He quickly raised his arm and flicked up his holo. "Holy shit, it's him! Audio only."
"Jeff,"
began the message. It was Isamu, whispering and sounding scared.
"I'm hoping you two are on the other side of that door. Obviously, I'm in with the bloody thing. I ducked into the supply airlock. I don't think it saw me yet, but there's no room in here to hide, and the damn door has a window. It's tearing apart people and DOMs right now. Tell Jenkins, tell someone that thing busted a hole in the inner corridor wall. It's after something. Get the hell out of here. I know you two are hanging around thinking you can help. You can't. Get the feck out."
The transmission ceased. "He just broke about 100 regs sending that," said Gia. Jeff brought up a message interface, but Gia grabbed his arm. "No, you can't respond. Sasoris can sense electromagnetic waves. The thing may have already located him." She's right," said Jimmy. Comms was his non-combat assignment. "You guys should find cover." More screaming and crashing sounds came from the other side of the blast door. None of them said what they were thinking. Jimmy squeezed his eyes shut. His teeth chattered. "What do you mean, you guys?" asked Jeff. "What the feck are you gonna do, man? Look at you." Jimmy pulled his hand out of his pocket and held out the injector in his shaking hand. "I'm gonna take this," he said. Gia rolled her eyes. "You're gonna take an allergy injection, dumbass?" "This is Compound 6, said Jimmy. His hand shook so much he almost dropped the injector. The soldiers looked at him, dumbfounded. "Bloody hell," said Jeff. "Are you out of your feckin' mind? Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter," said Jimmy. "That thing," he was barely holding it together. Images from his nightmares crawled all over the back of his eyes. "It's doing... you know what it's doing. It may already be too late. Let me try to get Isamu. Maybe I can make up for my... For being a coward?" asked Gia angrily. "For being a dipwad hoosh freak instead of a soldier?" "Easy, Gia," said Jeff. "She's right," said Jimmy. "Yes, for that." "Is that shit even gonna work on a junkie like you?" she asked. "Look at you, man. You can barely stand." "That's C6, G," said Jeff. "It's super tech, molecular level shit. That ain't no drug. That's a transformation." Another boom from behind the blast door. More scraping metal. "It may be his only chance, G," said Jeff. "What the hell can we do?" Reluctantly, Gia nodded. "Do it," said Jeff. "But we're staying. You get him, you bring him here, and you don't let that thing back this way. Deal?" Jimmy nodded, half paralyzed by fear. Get behind me," he said. Jimmy knew if he thought too much about what he was about to do, his nerve would evaporate. So he closed his eyes, jammed the injector against his thigh, and pushed the button. And he was reborn. The pain was more intense than anything he had ever felt in the totality of his life. His very being descended into chaos, submerged in hellish fire. He felt his insides deconstructed and reconstituted into something more than human. The transformation was so rapid he couldn't even scream. He looked down at his hands and saw them semi-translucent and pulsing with an eerie orange light. His vision zoomed in. His vision capabilities had greatly expanded, and he saw his skin transformed. The same translucency was permeated with hexagonal scales. His muscles refined and enlarged visibly, and it seemed as though all his limbs slightly elongated. His hair dissolved into nothing. Eyebrows, eyelashes, and body hair, all of it. Jimmy unknowingly placed the injector in his pocket and looked up. Jeff and Gia stared back in fascination. The incredible transformation had taken less than 10 seconds. One moment, a shaking, hoosh-addicted, and mentally anguished soldier stood hunched over in front of them. Now he stood as an iron tower, a perfectly balanced, mutated fighting machine. Inhuman eyes stared back at them. The whites had disappeared only to be replaced by orange hexagons, filling the entire eye. It was impossible to see what he was looking at. "Feck me," said Gia. To say Jimmy felt different would be the understatement of eternity. He had transformed into some kind of higher-order human. He was bigger, taller, and his movements were more precise than those of the most elegant timepiece. His field of vision was wide and saw into multiple spectra. Brimming under the surface was a strength begging to be unleashed. His panic had somewhat receded. For all of this, he was still himself. The whoosh withdrawal was still affecting him. While he no longer shook outwardly, he still felt its haunting call on both the physical and mental planes of existence. He had taken on a strange dual nature. He was a titanium steel sword with a hidden, rusted core. How hard would he be able to strike before he shattered? His fear of the stingers held on tight despite his new modified existence. He worried it could still unhinge him at any moment. It was a fear so primal that he'd fed for so long, no mere chemical application could cure it. The chaos still raged inside. Jimmy was disappointed the compound didn't instill some kind of barroom-like bravery. It was still him that was going to go through that door. He would be forced to face the fear at the core of his existence in order to save Isamu. He turned to face the blast door. They were made to be indomitable, bastions against not only fire and loss of atmosphere, but the fury and might of the stingers. To save Isamu and have any hope of thwarting the aliens' purposes, he would have to get through that door. "What now, buff boy?" Jeff asked. "You look tough, but even blasters are no use against those doors." Maybe courage wasn't pulsing through his veins like he'd hoped, but something else sure was. Power, yet more than that. Capability? But there was an edge of unpredictability and insanity mixed with it. Jimmy wondered how much control he'd have once he got started. "Get your emergency breathers on," said Jimmy, with a hexagonal alien stare the soldiers found unsettling. "And stand back. There's likely no air behind this door, so what's on this side will be compromised. I'm going to bring Isamu back." He felt certain he could succeed, if only he could hold back his fear. "What about you?" asked Gia. "There's no air on that side for you either. How are you going to help Isamu if you can't breathe? We don't have extras. There's no breather box nearby." Jimmy's head turned toward them in a blur. "I'll be fine. Get back." Time was running out. Somehow he knew he wouldn't need a breather. The blast door had no window and no handholds. He faced the door, quickly considered, then slammed his fist into the steel. A rectangular 6-inch square, 4 inches deep, appeared. Rapidly he punched 2 more times, forming an 18-inch trench. Jimmy positioned himself in a crouch and grabbed the edge of the trench with both hands. To Jeff and Gia, Jimmy's movements were bird-like, nearly too fast to follow. No movement was wasted. The hoosh-addicted soldier-turned-compound freak was now pulling on the trench he'd made. His elongated and rippling shoulders and arms bulged and tensed. The back of his shirt ripped. Quickly, the 2 soldiers put on breathers pulled from pockets. Jimmy wasn't waiting to see if they'd complied. They heard metal creak and scrape. Gia and Jeff took a number of steps back in disbelief. The door was moving. As an opening appeared on the right side of the corridor, atmosphere began whooshing through. Jimmy knew the stinger would be nearby. Maybe right on the other side of the door. The two soldiers pulled their blasters knowing they wouldn't do any good. Jimmy pulled harder. His body was constantly updating the forces and application of each muscle to maximize the effort. The adjustments happened on a microscopic level, millisecond by millisecond. The door became easier to move. Moments later, there was a 1-meter gap between the blast door and the corridor wall. Air was rushing through the opening, and he heard disquieting noises. Fear continued to threaten his sanity, but he was emboldened by his success. It gave him a little courage. Hoosh and C6 continued to wage war inside him, both physiologically and mentally. His only way through the chaos was forward, and there was no going back. He stepped through the opening. The intense cold that met him had little effect on his modified form. Exhaled moisture crystallized into tiny explosions. His eyes inexplicably focused on everything at once, an input he could barely process. The blinking amber lights reflected off the skin of 2 dead soldiers who had been running toward the blast door. The condition of their bodies struck a chord of fear deep within him, amplifying it. 20 meters ahead lay Dom's, a popular drinking establishment. On the opposite corridor wall, a 3-meter gooey black substance was vibrating, surrounded by frayed wiring and piping. The ship's systems had done their job to patch the breach caused by the violent entry, although it looked like the substance was barely maintaining integrity. He heard noises coming from the turn in the corridor ahead. Humans suffering, clicking and screeching. It scraped down his spine and pounded at his sanity. He remembered counseling sessions where he'd laughably tried exposure therapy by talking through his fear of just such an encounter. There was no way to simulate each horror. Either one found the courage to step forward into fear, or one didn't. Jimmy didn't feel courageous, yet here he was, and he had to go on. He was Isamu's only hope. He might be the ship's only hope. His body shuddered from converging forces. Fear and withdrawal, C6 and adrenaline. Every surface of his being felt like a razor-sharp edge, raw and open. Part of his mind was screaming for him to run, but something deep in his soul urged him on. Another loud bang. Jimmy moved past Dom's, and his newly expanded vision registered more bodies and heavy damage to the establishment. Nightmare visions flailed through his consciousness, snake-like forms ending in large stingers, coils around his neck, a stinger in his chest, alien, insect-like eyes holding him in frozen fear, slimy, crustaceous, chitin-like body parts sliding over him. Jimmy tried to slam a door on the intruding thoughts, but something kept pushing from the other side. Fearful and fragmenting, he turned the corner. The corridor terminated 50 meters away at the supply airlock, where he hoped Isamu was still alive. He feared to see the nightmare of the stinger, but the creature had disappeared into a hole in the corridor wall, leaving wreckage in its wake. Was it chasing prey or pursuing some nefarious mission? Jimmy's heartbeat banged in his ears as he moved forward and peered into the dark hole. The alien had penetrated through a foot or more of steel plating to burst into some kind of lab. Emergency lighting pulsed flashes of horror into the darkness. He could hear the Sasari moving. Whatever it was doing, it needed to be stopped. But Jimmy was flagging. Despite the compound, the Hoosier side was still present. His hands opened and closed. He had to get Isamu. Then he heard a muffled human voice. Jimmy turned toward the airlock and saw Isamu's face in the window. 6 precise, measured steps brought him to the door. "If you have a breather," said Jimmy, "put it on." Isamu pulled one from a leg pouch, his eyes wide as he looked back through the window. Jimmy tapped the door controls. As the inner airlock door opened, Isamu stared in shock. "What the feck?" he asked, his voice muffled by the breather as he momentarily forgot his peril. Puffs of frost escaped the apparatus around his mouth, and he hugged himself, shivering. "What the bloody hell is up with your eyes? Holy shit! Your whole being is changed." "I'm on C6, said Jimmy, grabbing Isamu's arm and yanking him into the corridor. "Bloody hell," said Isamu, stumbling as he was pulled but unable to take his gaze off Jimmy's eyes. "And I'm barely keeping it together," said Jimmy. "I got through the blast door at the other end. Gia and Jeff are waiting. I don't know what that thing is doing, but let's not wait and find out." Isamu was subjected to inhuman but controlled strength as the addict pulled his squad leader down the corridor toward the opening where the Sasori had disappeared. Even though they were soldiers, they tried to avoid seeing the human carnage scattered across the corridor. Limbs and pieces of torso unavoidably forced their way into Jimmy's amplified vision. Blood darkened on the floor and walls under the continual flashing of the amber alarm lights. Jimmy slowed as they approached the hole where the stinger entered. He heard noises. It was closer than before. Feck, muttered Isamu. "Shit, I've never been this cold." Jimmy's hearing was on par with his vision. He knew the horror was coming his way. His fear was cranking up his heart rate like a mechanic pouring gas into a carburetor. The sound pounded in his ears and distracted him. He had to get Isamu back to the blast door. They had to move. They had to move now. "We're going," said Jimmy. "Stay on my left side. If it comes out at us, it'll get me first. No matter what happens, you get to that blast door. Deal?" "Bloody hell, yes," said Isamu. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. A deserter, hooked up on Hoosh, was jacked up on a secret military super soldier compound. It was unlikely as Jeff giving up cursing. "Do it, man." Jimmy grabbed hold of Isamu's fatigues. The Hoosier's head turned in a quick and precise movement, orange eyes looking everywhere and nowhere. "Here we go," said Jimmy. They went. Bitter cold leaked through the blast door opening, chilling the soldiers. "We can't just hide here," said Jeff. "If feckin' Jimmy went in there, how can we stay here?" "What is it you think we'll do?" asked Gia, holding up her blaster. "These things don't do shit." "Maybe, but if Hoosh Boy fails, that thing is going to kill us anyway. I'd rather choose the way I go." "Fair point," muttered Gia. "Maybe we distract that thing long enough for Jimmy to do who knows what," said Jeff. "That C6 shit, maybe this is why they made that stuff." "He's an untrained addict," said Gia. "That stuff wasn't made for someone like him." Jeff shrugged. "I'm not going to hide and wait to die. Not a single ship has survived one of these attacks yet." Gia looked into Jeff's eyes. "For Isamu?" she asked. Jeff nodded. "For Isamu."